Good morning. My name is James Stanger on a fairly hot Australia summer morning. I'd like to do a video and start a new series on IVF and risks. And the first one in that series will be about disputed paternity. The reason for this video was prompted by an article which I'm going to read to you in Inside Reproductive Health. 2 lawsuits haunt fertility fields from instance 45 years apart. Now, this is an open podcast website that provides excellent information. I would recommend you do it, and this is the URL to it, right? But basically, this article basically says 2 recently filed lawsuits against fertility clinics for allegedly mixing up specimens showcase how error prevention protocols have evolved in the IVF sector. As we all know, our clients and embryologists and the CEO's worst nightmare is this sort of information in the press. Savannah IVF mix-up case heads to mediation. Actually, I got the wrong movement from my UI. This is 1 7 months old. This is where Monash admits the second bundle, but they put the wrong embryo back. This was for a same-sex couple, but they put the embryo back belonging to one woman, not the typical one. So it was sort of a half a mix-up, but the bottom line is it's not what they wanted. And of course, more recently, Florida IVF clinic under fire after a woman gives birth to a baby that's not genetically hers. The really interesting thing is that the scenario is when the child is not genetically related to the parents. Who has their embryos? How can they find where their embryos have gone? But this is a really difficult question. It's a needle in the haystack. How can a clinic identify and trace events that occurred in the laboratory 12, 24, 36, 48, even 100 months ago? It's a real nightmare. So clinics actually provide a duty of care to clients to ensure that they transfer embryos as approved by the client. So one of the Monash case was same-sex couple, but the couples wanted the embryos transferred from the non-receiving partner into the collateral partner. But in fact, what they put back is the embryos belonging to that same woman. So it wasn't really a mix-up in the thing. It just wasn't what they wanted. Clients put a lot of faith in the clinic systems to ensure that the baby they have is theirs. But at the same time, busy clinics, and we've just seen another video on a decreased efficiency, is that clinics have got really busy in the last 10 years, 2 or 3, 400% busier. So busy clinics are at risk of claims of using the incorrect gametes or embryos. There's a huge existential risk to clinics' reputation and financial risk if they cannot prove their systems are sound. And if you look at Monash, to see it, half the executives have been dismissed because of that one error. It's devastating. If the paternity is questioned about whether the clinic used the wrong sperm, there is virtually no recourse. However, I'd just like to get on shaky ground. If I asked Google AI the incidence of paternity discrepancy, it comes back with an instance, and well, I don't know how true it is, it's just what Google AI is telling me, and there are references here, but around about 2% of all babies born in Sweden, the UK and Australia are not by the social partner. So when they do genetic testing, they realise that the husband could not have been the father of the child. But no one talks about this. It's actually higher in some groups than others. But 1 in 50 babies in the community is not conceived by the husband. So there's been an error, which I won't get into because this is dangerous ground, except we're looking at that in relationship to IVF, where a clinic makes a mistake. It's catastrophic. Okay, I know I'm shaky ground here, but I raise the issue because I perceive clinics are at an existential risk of being unable to defend themselves against a disputed paternity claim. And I have in my 45 years of IVF had a couple of situations where I believe we are being manipulated by clients, knowingly or unknowingly. But now that in the public's eyes that a clinic can do wrong, any disputed claim for disputed paternity will be seen to be true. That is, the clinic made a mistake. There is no other choice. The law, this undoubtedly is true, right? Clinics are vulnerable unless they can demonstrate that their error rate is virtually zero. So just getting back to this article, this is an article by Ron Shigman. I'm going to read it out because it's quite a good one, actually. And I can do that because I believe it's open access, etc. I've written to email these people, but they haven't replied. So the author, Ron Shipman, writes in Inside Reproductive Health, 2 recent filed lawsuits against fertility clinics have allegedly for allegedly mixing up specimen showcase how error prevention protocols have evolved in the IVF sector. The first lawsuit was filed in the State Court of Oregon in late December. It accused the Oregon Health and Science University of Portland of using the wrong sperm for an IUI procedure. The alleged botched procedure occurred in 1980, although it was apparently only discovered recently. How can you defend yourself for something that happened 45 years ago? It is impossible. The plaintiffs in that suit are that the child was born as a result of procedure and their parents, and all are going by initials in the lawsuit to protect their privacy. I don't really understand that. But the family is seeking $17 million in damages. $17 million. That includes $5 million for damages apiece, plus $1 million for health issues that allegedly occurred as a result of the child having a different biological father than expected, and an additional $1 million for mental health counselling the family claims that they need going forward. Nicole wrote out a spokesman for the Oregon Health Service, declined to comment on the lawsuit, citing the pending litigation. However, she did note that the Health Services Unit for Fertility Clinic had a long history of providing safe, high-quality health care. And I'd like to make a comment that a history of having a safe, high-quality health care does not protect one from this claim of $17 million. The other suit was filed in a state court in Palm Beach, Florida. Earlier this year, the month, it alleges the Fertility Center of Orlando botched an IVF procedure in March 2025 and the implanted embryos that belonged to someone else. The plaintiffs, who are also not anonymized in the lawsuit, note that they are Caucasians, and the mother gave birth to in December, was not. The suit alleges the clinic has not responded to requests to try and identify to whom these embryos belong to, but more importantly, if their embryos have been transferred and where they have gone. Pop-up statement from the Fertility Center of Oregon's website acknowledges the issue. We're actively cooperating with the investigation to support one of our patients in determining the source of an error that resulted in the birth of a child who is not genetically related to them, the pop-up states in part. Multiple entities are involved in this process, and all parties are working diligently to help identify when and where the error may have occurred. It's really hard. Okay, moving on. The author then cites Stephen Katz, saying such errors happen about once every 125,000 procedures. So instead of being 1 in 50, it's 1 in 125,000. Such mix-ups are incredibly uncommon these days, according to Stephen Katz, who's Chief Executive Officer and founder of REI Protect, an Arizona-based insurer that specializes in liability coverage for fertility clinics. It currently provides coverage for slightly more than half of such clinics in the US. I might point out this is now a cost of business, so maybe the cost, maybe $1,000 for every IVF cycle is actually paying for insurance. I may be making that up, but that would be an order. Katz estimate that mix-up occur about 4 to 5 times a year nationwide, or about 1 in every 125,000 procedures. Now, I think this is a concern because if you look at some publications looking at electronic witnessing, there are a number of errors that occur, but these are not errors that have resulted in the wrong embryo. These are errors of having the wrong dish, the potential errors. So I'm actually not sure that 4 to 5 times a year, even 1 in 125,000, is actually correct. I think it's an overestimate. If you look at the number of lawsuits, considering there's been something almost like 20 million babies born, and the number of lawsuits are probably only in the 10s or 20s. Not to say there aren't a lot of sleepers out there, but currently there's not an awful lot of litigation, even though each one is tragic. I understand that. But basically, it's incredibly rare. The point, though, is when it happens, the shit hits the fan. Right? And $17 million claim is just a huge hit on a clinic. You actually could even send a clinic broke. So according to Katz, training of scientific staff has improved over the decades to avoid specimen confusion that leads to grave errors. How would you handle a cup of sperm? Well, cup's not the right word. It's completely different now than it was decades ago. Although Katz was unable to estimate how the error rates have changed over the years, he noted that given the number of procedures has grown dramatically, while the number of errors remains quite low, suggests the new protocols are working. And you'd hope that bit by bit, Everyone is getting more and more efficient and conscious of it as they get busier. Eva Schenkman, a PhD and embryology lab director and consultant based in Rocky Mountain, I assume that's North Carolina, observed that back in the early 1980s, there really wasn't a chain of custody for semen. It wasn't uncommon for specimens to have the mother's name on them, but not the father's, which could cause confusion. This could be further compounded by processing such specimens simultaneously for the sake of efficiency, another practice that has almost disappeared, she said. Yes, we've gotten safer over the years, Schenkman said, but are we where we should be? Absolutely not. Well, I grew up in IVF in the 1980s and 1990s, and I have to take some exception to this. I think even from the very start, from 1978, each major transfers was double checked and signed for. There was a chain of custody in terms of being able to define when things were done and who did them. And there was very little work there whereby work was done simultaneously. I think all the clinics that I'm aware of, particularly in Australia, don't know about America, but basically there's been a very high level of consciousness of IVF right from the start. And this, I think, is reflected why there are so few lawsuits going back from the 1980s. Now that ancestry testing is now occurring, you may have expected if there were a lot of errors, there would have been far more lawsuits, but there aren't. And even though there may be some sleepers, I actually think that 1 in 125,000 is a gross overestimate. I think it's far less than that. But the REI to protect drop labs without electronic witnessing after 2026. One of the most important developments in avoiding errors is electronic witnessing. That is the use of either electronic barcodes or radio frequency identification specifically tied to a specific patient. Barcodes or radio frequency tags are affixed to each Petri dish or any other object tied to the IVF cycle, including frozen canes, frozen straws. Clinic staff use laser scans to identify those objects and ensure they are not mixed up at the time of handling. It has been inevitably replacing one and then two-person witnessing in IVF clinics in recent years. Katz says that at the beginning of 2027, REI Protect will no longer insure clinics that do not use electronic witnessing. It is also offering an official seal of approval for practices that not only use electronic witnessing, but also have additional safeguards in place. We're hoping that the seal of approval on their website patients will pay attention to that and really focus on the care being performed in IVF labs that make the extra effort. And at this point in time, I need to also say that clients also have an obligation to check the clinic they're going to and how they manage the safeguards of embryo identity. And it's naive for clinics just to go into a clinic, hand a sample over, and then come back 2 or 3 days later for embryos to be transferred without asking how they cannot be reassured that there's no errors occurring. Katz also believes that IVF technology progresses, automation of labs will accelerate, and that could present issues of their own that will eventually be mitigated. So when the robots take over, will it be better or not? Schenkman observed that despite the improvement of safety protocols, there are still regulatory gaps here that are frustrating. She states that regulation is much more aggressive in the EU than the US, and there are still 5 to 8% of labs that are not operating with certification from the College of American Pathologists. Embryology and andrology labs are also not governed by the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments Act, the federal regulation that provides oversight to practically every medical laboratory. But I can guarantee you it will. Yes, we've gotten safer over the years, Schenkman says, but are we where we should be? Absolutely not. Well, I think we should be getting very close to it. So I'd just like to finish up by saying I've already done a YouTube video on electronic witnessing and another one on sperm microfluidics where the sperm are being processed without spinning. But what can a clinic do to protect itself from future claims, for paternity claims? Well, I think the important thing is for the owners to accept responsibility. They should review their quality management system to ensure that the best preventive steps are being taken, and these are signed off by senior management. It is naive to think that the senior management, doctors and administrators, assume that all the quality management systems are working perfectly. If they're not actually signed off it themselves, they're the ones that carry the can. But there should always include some form of electronic witnessing, and I would also have double witnessing steps are critical ones. And in terms of paternity disputes, I would recommend that every clinic freeze a sample of the sperm used in the IVF ICSI have that frozen down and stored for 50 years. It'll only take one dewar, take thousands of samples, but if ever there is a dispute, you'll be able to pull that one sample out and have it tested and to actually know when in fact the clinic made a mistake or not. If you do that and you can demonstrate that the sperm that you use to the ICSI belong to the father, right, you saved yourself $17 million. It's cheap at half the price. It isn't something that we have historically done. I know some clinics in the past have tried to save genetic material from the clients, but I would say, knowing that there are sufficient lawsuits now, it's getting more common, that this at least should be, going forward, should be a major. Now, I also think that the clinician has to accept responsibility for this. I think the clinician and the client should review the samples containing straws beforehand, before each transfer insemination. In my experience, in most clinics, the lady walks in for a transfer, hops on the table, speaks to the doctor, and then the embryologist walks in with the embryos in a transfer catheter, and the transfer is done. But I would argue that the clinician is the one that gets sued. They're the one that has to pay the $17 million. And each clinician should be satisfied when they walk into the embryology lab to say, show me that you have the samples for Mr. X or Mrs. X or Mrs. Y. The real issue is that most problems arise in the lab and often a long time in the past. Yet it's the clinic's reputation is at risk, and it may occur before any current staff or directors were appointed. As we have seen from past public exposures of errors, the damage can be financially crippling and permanent. While the risk may be infinitesimally small compared to the real world, and I'm actually being honest here, in the real world, the background error rate is 1 in 50, right? So an error rate of 1 in a quarter or half a million is infinitesimally small, but no one cares. No one cares. And rightly so, because it's their life and there's a duty of care. So I'm not actually transferring responsibility. I'm just recognizing there's a double standard. With an increased corporatized IVF world, the risks are greater as their capacity to manage risks adversity also increases, but at a cost, and their liability will also increase because they are more corporatized. Also, it will be spread around multiple labs and clinics, so there might be like 5 or 10 labs, part of a corporate group, where instead of one lab, so an error can occur in any one of those, but the risk is still taken by the whole group. And the last thing is that, in my experience, a lot of senior staff now who run these big corporate boards, they're not medical or scientifically trained. I know in Australia, where a lot of the board members of the big corporations that run IVF in Australia, a large number of those people are not medical or scientific. They're business people. And I think with such huge payout and poor defense, the DNA test will prove culpability. I think clinics are vulnerable to pre-medication. If I've thought about it, other people will think about it. $17 million for one error is a lot of money. A frozen sample of the ICSI specimen will be ultimate backup, and I would encourage clinics to at least talk about that at a clinical meeting. But the biggest risk is staff burnout and mixing of multiple functions required of staff. I know one big study showed that the biggest concern they had was at the time of ICSI, and the second thing was working on a Sunday afternoon with minimum staff, but being very busy. Maybe a robotics will change the risk, but I doubt it. It'll just transfer it. And maybe once in every 125,000 procedures is probably actually only once in a clinic's lifetime. But who wants to have that hanging over your head? So I think the risk of burnout, the real answer to the question is address how busy your staff, laboratory staff are, and make sure that they are not being over exploited and then vulnerable to making an error. I'd like to stop now and just read up. My name's James Danger. I'm an embryologist with 50 years experience. I'm not a medical person, and this information is not medical advice, but it may help you knowing what questions to ask about your treatment with your doctor, and maybe to help in understanding the advice that you receive. If you like what I'm doing, press subscribe, make a comment, and press like. Just like to acknowledge that this is being funded by my other activity, which is providing an online EQA program in training program in andrology and embryology. And I'd just like to thank you for your time. If you managed to get this far, your perseverance, you're well done. IVF is a personal journey. I know that it involves the actions of many techniques, issues, challenges, staff, and people. And it helps to understand all aspects of that journey. I hope this information may be of value. If you like it being provided, tell others about this service, and please subscribe. And at that point in time, sorry, I just shouldn't have done that. I just need to back. We don't. I just like to stop